Cate Faehrmann is a Greens MP in New South Wales, and Jeremy Buckingham is a legalised cannabis MP in New South Wales. So, yeah, we've actually got two different political parties sitting here. So thanks, guys, for getting together to really talk through what it's like really working with within the New South Wales government, and particularly the Labor government, and I guess some of their stuff they say during the election and then stuff they don't do after the election, essentially, and how that ties into how we get pot legalised. So thanks, guys, for coming, and over to you.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. Absolutely great to be here. My name's Cate Faehrmann. I'm a Greens MP in the New South Wales Upper House, alongside Jeremy Buckingham, who's also a MP, but not a Greens one, a legalised Cannabis Party MP in the New South Wales Upper House. And we're here today to chat with you about what's going on in terms of the New South Wales Parliament and drug law reform. But before I begin, of course, would like to acknowledge that we are here on Bundjalung country, and this is Aboriginal land, stolen land. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. So Jeremy and I are actually in what is called the balance of power in the New South Wales Upper House, actually. We're in this position that I don't think progressive parties have been in for a very long time, and that is that for the New South Wales government to pass laws, you've got the lower house and the upper house, similar to pretty much the same as the federal parliament in terms of the Senate. And in the New South Wales upper house, the New South Wales government, Labor Party, Chris Minns and his Labor Party need 6 votes essentially to pass laws in the upper house. There are 4 Greens MPs in the upper house. We've got 3 Greens MPs in the lower house, 4 in the upper house. We're all women. And Jeremy's there. There's an Animal Justice Party member as well. Usually, not always, of course, but that's 6 of us that can help the Labor government pass any law it wants to when it comes to drug law reform, right? It's actually the most progressive Parliament, the most progressive parliament in terms of numbers that we've ever had in New South Wales. But we've got Chris Minns as the Premier that is just paralysed, it seems, actually, which is incredibly frustrating. So just a quick bit of history in terms of what I've done as the party's drug law reform spokesperson over the last few years, just so you kind of know where everything's at there and what's on the table. We can, and I'll pass to Jeremy in terms of what he's put on as well, I assume. In the last parliament, so before the last election, I introduced a bill and second read it. I did a speech to it in Parliament to legalise cannabis, to establish a cannabis authority to tax and regulate cannabis. There's a lot of detail in it. We did a lot of work. It wasn't debated. There was no opportunity to debate it. But frankly, I'm very careful about what we do debate, because we actually don't want a bill to go down and for a particular party to register their no vote, if you like, for something. Strategically, that's not great. So we did that. I have also the same with a pill testing bill to obviously implement drug checking at music festivals and fixed site as well as a bill to provide an exemption, a defence for people who are caught in the horrendous roadside drug testing operations with traces of THC in the system, which we talk about in almost every single session in MardiGrass every single year. That bill went to an inquiry in the last parliament, went to a one-day inquiry. It was very interesting, to be honest. At that point, I thought most of the MPs actually realised that the law has to change in some ways. They realised it was kind of unfair the evidence is ridiculously overwhelming. It's always very hard in those inquiries to get anybody speaking against things. Like, there's all the science and the facts and the evidence, and then they have to get somebody like, what is it, the Australian Drug Foundation or whatever it is, that are very, very conservative and very anti-drugs and don't make sense to come and speak on the other, to provide balance, if you like. So that was all in the last parliament. This parliament, and so we weren't going to get anything, right, in terms of numbers. This parliament, as I said, we're kind of in the balance of power. There's Sue Higginson, one of my Greens colleagues in the upper house as well. So we are ready. Like, we're ready to get reform through. What we know, though, is that Chris Minns has said we need to wait for a drug summit. At some point he said that. He kind of says it, but we don't know when a drug summit is going to happen. So I've given notice again of a bill to legalise cannabis, the same bill to tax and regulate cannabis, the same bill in terms of providing a defence for people caught with trace of THC in the system if they're in possession of a script for medicinal cannabis. And there's like 1 million. David Halpern had an incredible stat at a webinar we did the other day with Tamara Smith, who is a Greens member for Ballina, and at that webinar, 1 million individual medicinal cannabis users in terms of scripts across the country. Incredible. Plus pill testing. So I've got those bills there, as well as drug decriminalisation generally. So my view, though, in terms of kind of where we're going with this, what we're going to hope to get out of it, we don't know when the drug summit is going to be, although everybody's kind of talking about October. But you'd think that at some point the government actually has to announce it and prioritise it. I kind of am slightly concerned about the overall kind of zeitgeist right now, in terms of the focus being very much on cost of living, trauma, homelessness, social unrest, violence. And I kind of am thinking housing, obviously, and I'm kind of thinking where the government is setting its priorities and thinking of where to prioritise. Plus, we've got a Premier who is just so reactive to the front page of the Telly, 2GB and Sky. He actually doesn't act on anything. If it's actually not there, he doesn't act. And I think they're already starting to niggle a little bit on particular drug issues. And I've been kind of thinking that if you were Chris Minns, like 2 years out from an election, 2.5 years out from an election, what's in it for him and his government to do anything in relation to drug law reform? What areas of drug law reform, and this is what you have to ask yourself as a political strategist and setting campaign strategy, what is going to make him want to move in this area? I think the low-hanging fruit for us is definitely roadside drug testing reform, absolutely. I think, like all the evidence is in from other jurisdictions, from Tasmania. Again, every MP, I'm sure Jeremy's the same, every MP you speak to is kind of going, what the hell? It's basically our road laws have not kept up with the fact that this is now an incredibly popular medicine, legally prescribed in this state. So that's one. And the second one for me is obviously drug checking and pill testing, but I think we need to look at decriminalisation broadly. The Minns government's introduced the court diversion program. This was after the ICE inquiry, made heaps of recommendations, big recommendations around decriminalising all drugs. This is the kind of decrim light, very light, if you like, but it essentially allows the police the discretion, if somebody's caught with a personal quantity of drugs, any drug, the police has the discretion to issue a $400 criminal infringement notice, and for an adult that could be twice. So that's kind of better than we had, but it's at the police discretion. I was speaking to somebody else. I was speaking to somebody in the sector the other day, and they had said they got a briefing and it looked like the police weren't really using it very much. Like, it's been in for a few months and there's hardly any data around it. They're actually not using it very much other than for cannabis. So for me, with New South Wales and the outrageous expenditure that is spent on police harassing people, 200,000 tests now a year that they have a target of in terms of roadside drug tests. Music festivals are closing down 12 times as much it costs music festival organisers to pay for police, up to 12 times as much here than it does in Queensland for the same festival, for the same amount of people. Absolutely outrageous. And we're seeing all our music festivals, particularly in New South Wales, close down. One of the things we could look at, and I'll hand to Jeremy in a sec, is looking at the economics, because it is all about budget and it is all about cost of living, and thinking about the economics of the ridiculous waste of public money spent on harassing people. There's 200,000 tests. As I said, you know, dozens of police at every single music festival. I live in Sydney, Redfern. There are all the stations, pubs. It is absolutely ridiculous. Meanwhile, you know, we've got so many other issues, not least domestic and sexual violence, that isn't getting the resources that it needs. So I think we've got a, leading into the drug summit, the biggest question that I'm asking everybody I'm talking with in terms of politicians is, if you were Chris Minns, what's in it for him to act on drug law reform at the moment in terms of this cost of living crisis? We've got to think about how it will improve New South Wales and some of the issues that we're facing in terms of homelessness, in terms of other issues, for him to actually act right now. And in terms of when a drug summit is, as I said, at the end of the year, probably, but I don't know. I'm not impressed with the Labor government. I don't know whether Jeremy feels a little bit better about them, but I am not impressed with where they're going. And I don't know. Do you think we're going to see this like ridiculous like reform under Labor, Jeremy?
Not. Well, I'd say this. I'd say that we're never going to see it out of the coalition. So, we have to hope that that the Minns government develops some spine. The indications aren't good. It's a very, very small target government. They've really limited the amount of time that Parliament's sitting. We're only sitting, 13, 14, 15 weeks of the year, and that's like a 3-day week, and one of those days is a half day. So, you know, like, it's not really a massive legislative load, and that's a real strategy of sidelining the Parliament and sidelining the people, the other voices, and sidelining the community, democracy, and everything's being run basically out of Chris Minns' office. So, and Kate's absolutely right. It's a very reactive, small target government, and the question is a good one. Why is it in the government's interest to do something on this now? And we have to find out ways to do that. And so I think it's really interesting going back into Parliament and really focusing in on this issue, looking at the legacy of the campaign. And so, you know, Ian Cohen, elected for the Greens in when, like 1850 or something, how long was he there? 1995, in there advocating, you know, and I think some of the Democrats as well in their time advocating for cannabis law reform. You know, there's 30 years of parliamentary activism and 50, 60 years of community activism around this, and we can learn a lot from what has come before and what did and didn't work. And I think the real opportunity is for us to recognise what the decision makers, what's guiding the decision makers, and it's, you know, self-interest. It's the only horse in the race, as they say. What's in their self-interest? And Kate's right. Like, the optics at the moment, the the first order issues of the government make it less likely, I think, for them to be brave in this area unless we can be clever. And I think one of the key things we can do is turn the law and order argument back at the government. We can turn the community safety argument around. And so if we want to be tough on crime, well, let's be tough on organised crime. Let's take away their business model. You want to protect kids? We'll regulate drugs to make sure that quality control and distribution isn't, done by the nomads or, the banditos or the coffin cheaters or someone like that, the bikie gangs. Making sure that those arguments that have been often used to frame the conversation and used against us who are calling for an end to prohibition, they're turned back on them. And I think that's a very effective way for us to reset the narrative. You want to be tough on crime, you want to be a hero on the Daily Telegraph, you want to look after kids, we'll bring in pill testing, save lives, make our community safer. And that's a really, really strong messaging that I think resonates. And building up that body of evidence. Cate's done a lot of good work in terms of inquiries, in terms of roadside drug testing, which was set the rational basis for that reform there, and we can rely on that. And that's been super useful. And everyone's the other thing in that space, be it the Greens, be it the Legalised Cannabis Party or community advocates, there's a lot of coherence. We've got a consistent message based on, data, based on the community experience, and that's whether or not it's the advocates, Cate, myself, the Premier's hearing the same thing over and over again, and I agree that's probably the low-hanging fruit. That's the one thing we've got to achieve this term of government in the cannabis space. Whether or not we end up in a situation with the Labor Party taking a legalisation policy or model to the next election, maybe. I think I'd err on the side of unlikely. But there's work we can do, and so I've initiated I've got a bill as well. Ours is the bill that they've introduced in WA, Victoria and New South Wales. Our personal adult use bill, legalisation of 6 plants grown at home, indoors, outdoor, possession of the pot from those, sharing and gifting with your friends. So a non-commercial model. Got that bill. I've had that bill and some other terms of reference referred to a committee, and that committee is undertaking a pretty large inquiry into the current and the development of the current regulatory regime for cannabis. Cate's on that committee. It's going to be an opportunity for us to bring in, hear from a lot of voices, all those submissions. And the reason I've done that now is so we can drill down into that, have a report, some recommendations that come before the drug summit. So we can, in the drug summit, we can say, well, we're not learning about these things for the first time. Here's a big inquiry that's made these recommendations. Let's put those, feed those, and the evidence from from our side of the argument into that debate. So Labor's a hard beast to deal with. They're very transactional and they demand loyalty. And they, if you do something against them, they don't forget it. Just ask the Greens. So we, in a sense, we have to be patient. But at a certain point, and especially as we go into the next state election, that we can put a lot of pressure on them. So I do think that it's a difficult time to get this reform up. Just right now in New South Wales with some of the things that are happening, but there's a massive political momentum growing that's coming from outside of Australia. It's coming from the Medcan side of things. It's coming from all these activists across class and demographics. The last thing, and I think there's a lot of hope in this space. There's a really interesting bill that's just been introduced into the US Senate by the Democrats, and it's the Administration and Legalisation of Cannabis Opportunities Bill, an Opportunities Act. And if you look at that bill, which is a really amazing document, it's 227 pages, but it's got a big preamble at the beginning about just the injustice, the historical injustices of prohibition and the war on drugs, and how that was a racist, it was designed to be a racist policy to crack down on minorities, on people of colour, the queer community, a political dissent. But what's fascinating about that bill is it recognises that, talks about how big cannabis is going to be, and then actually talks about how the war on drugs, where they're at the stage in America where they're talking about reparations. So for all those people that have been locked up, who lost their jobs, lost their career, lost their liberty, lost their lives because of the war on drugs, picked up for three strikes and you're in jail for 30 years for possession of cannabis. Not only are they're moving to expunge those convictions, which is something that I think we'll have to do here in time, but they're actually talking about reinvesting and reparations for those communities who just got absolutely fucked over by prohibition. So I think that's a really interesting part of the debate, and where I think it will go eventually.
Yeah, we can also take questions in a second as well, but there is no doubt that there's the community sentiment, and we know surveys from Australia and around the world largely are showing this huge increase in support for legalisation of cannabis. I saw something in the other day that was 75% now in the US, 75% of adults polled are supportive of legalisation. A decade ago it was 50%, which is incredible given, and that's because so many states have legalised. Every state obviously started with the kind of regulation of medicinal cannabis, and so many have a legal market, and they're obviously not seeing the sky fall in and of course seeing benefits, and that is incredibly valuable. We've got that a little bit here in Australia, a tiny bit really, in terms of the ACT. We've got the Queensland government moving on a few things. Queensland government recently, with pill testing, for example, every little bit matters when government sees sense and put in place harm reduction strategies that we've kind of been calling for some time. New South Wales is this extremely unfortunate conservative beast that we know with almost every social reform. If we call this a social reform, I call it a social reform. Dying with dignity, abortion law reform, it's just New South Wales. It's kind of dragging its heels. But right now, as I said, it's just that we are in this incredible position with the balance of power in the upper house, a drug summit coming, the Greens having various bills on the table, Jeremy and Legalised Cannabis having bills on the table ready to go. I've been waiting, and I think you've just said it that you have as well, but I've been waiting until the drug summit because strategically it's just stupid really to bring a bill, whether it's for pill testing or legalising cannabis, that will be voted down before the drug summit and kind of be this sentiment of the parliament that is very strong just before the drug summit. So we've kind of got it there ready. The drug summit, there's a lot of strategy going into it. A lot of the organisations and NGOs are meeting and working out, exactly in legalised cannabis is kind of one thing. There's different levels, of course, decriminalisation, what's going on in the ACT, but also a hell of a lot that they're talking about in terms of treatment and harm reduction. One example, I'm working with a community in Broken Hill. There's no detox and rehab services in Broken Hill. They have to travel people have to travel 800 kilometres if they want to go into rehab. Absolutely outrageous. The government's kind of hasn't even been thinking about it. These are the types of things I think from the drug summit that we also need to be talking about. Can we shift some of the bloody money that's being spent on 200,000 tests in terms of roadside drug testing, when we should be testing for impairment? We should be looking out in terms of impairment anyway. That's $10 million, by the way. We did a question of notice, $10 million just in the first half of last year. 10 million, which was something like 4 times as much as any previous year, and it was just for half of the year. Absolutely outrageous. So, yes, we have a lot we can get done in the drug space at the drug summit, and we certainly will have these bills in whatever form they are, and hopefully, we'll get obviously a consensus bill to be able to put the pressure on after the drug summit. And I reckon it's going to be on after that, honestly. We've kind of playing nicely, but in terms of our, weight, we can throw it around a bit in the upper house. And I think after the drug summit, that's when we're needing to seek and get commitments. And I tell you what, again, that reforming roadside drug testing has to be a big part of any mix with that.
Yeah, I totally agree, Cate. I totally agree. And I think that's the strategy. That's when we can really put the pressure on the government, and also continue to think about how the government makes its decisions. Okay, Ben Fordham's upset about something on 2GB. They jump. He says jump, and they say how high. The other leverage point for the Labor Party is the union movement. And so as part of the inquiry process and just generally, I've been lobbying key unions like the HSU, the Health Services Union, the PSA, the Transport Workers Union, the Rail Union, about some of the workplace discrimination issues, workplace safety issues, roadside drug testing issues, and medicinal cannabis, which is going to be is and will continue to grow as an issue for workers and for them as the representatives of organised labour. The benefit of doing that is those people decide who the politicians are. The way Labor conference is, they pick the Labor politicians. If you can get them moving on their policies, well, that puts the pressure on the Labor politicians, and they help write Labor Party policy. So that's another way that we can advocate, put pressure on Labor to do the right thing. They know that prohibition has failed. Legalising cannabis is just makes economic, social sense. It's just they're deciding when they're going to have the courage to actually do it. So what's interesting is, it's a sad thing about the establishment and power is a lot of it's based on relationships and mateship and all the rest of it. And I met with the Premier to talk to him about RDT and other issues, and it was really instructive. His anecdote was that a family friend of theirs was a big investor in medicinal cannabis and in hemp, and it had saved this person's granddaughter's life. And so it was someone he knew that had a big impact on, someone who was relatively close to him. And you could see he recognised that there were a lot of people in the community that are outside the sort of usual tropes about who a progressive or cannabis activists are, who are out there campaigning for us. A lot of people from across class, different demographics, different geography, different regions are out there because they've had a great experience with medicinal cannabis. It's made a difference to their lives. They've smoked cannabis and realised it's doing no harm. They're still a user. So there's a lot of advocates out there. Some of them are in surprising places, and they are putting pressure. The job for Cate and I is to make sure that community pressure, the union movement, all of the things we do get a result, and that is to get the Labor Party to take it's highly unlikely that they'll support either my bill or Cate's bill or a consensus bill, as it were. The way the Labor Party works is, they want to have ownership of it, I imagine. And so I hope that we can get them taking a position of legalisation to the next state election, and a result soon after that. But in the meantime, it's RDT and maybe some questions from you.
Yeah, does anybody have any questions?
With the mic.
Thank you. My name's Frances, I come from Perth. My question is about the negative effects of drug legalisation in the United States, particularly, the fentanyl epidemic and all that. And then in that situation, some NGOs have been very strident about harm minimisation to this point that it's become a negative word, harm minimisation, in the face of that epidemic. So I'm just wondering, how do we incorporate this issue into the legalised cannabis agenda, particularly in regards to our position on the legalisation of other drugs?
Yeah. Yes. It's actually something that I've been thinking about quite a lot lately. I went to Portugal 4 years ago to have a look at their decriminalisation model, and have been talking about that and talking it up for 4 years. Since then, we know that Oregon decriminalised and now they've recriminalised. There are some reports that are coming out of Portugal about increased rates of drug use now, homelessness among drug users, various issues in terms of increased crime rates. However, if you look at it more closely, obviously the cost of living, that's kind of happening everywhere as well in terms of increased homelessness. But what has also happened is a change of government and a reduction in the services provided. And the really, really important thing is that you can't just legalise a drug and not have all of the services for it. There are people who will get into trouble and who will use too heavily, and it will impact their life. They might not, or they should not potentially be take that drug. For example, people who probably shouldn't use cannabis heavily in terms of mental health issues, and that's strongly advised. Obviously, that's why it should be regulated, so people have that information. The issue with the decriminalisation now in terms of Oregon is exactly the same, in that the services aren't there, and so there is partly there's studies coming out now which I'm concerned about, and I feel will be used against us at the Drug Summit, for example. People bringing studies in about increased rate of addiction amongst particularly heavy users in some places where cannabis has been legalised. It seems to have social benefits, but there's a group of users that get into trouble. Again, treatment, education, making sure we've got that there. So it's got to be done right. And that's a big part of, sometimes potentially some of the legal markets in some places around the world haven't put some of the effort and resources into kind of education programs, support, and making sure all of that is there as well. I think it's a huge concern. This is why I kind of raised it at the beginning around what Chris Minns is going to be focusing on and the cost of living, because I think we're just going to see more and more of it. It's very easy for people to say, oh, look, this country's decriminalised, that one's legalised, that one's legalised. Look at this increase in crime and increase in, homelessness and violence. It's happening everywhere, as we're kind of seeing here too, in terms of the housing crisis. But there are parallels that have been drawn by very good researchers who are pro, drug law reform. So we can't ignore it. We have to actually look at it very truthfully as drug law reform campaigners and think, okay, we need to have all of the evidence before us. We need to be very, very careful about this and make sure that it's not just about people having more access to drugs and not being charged for drugs and being able to do what, but that help and support is so, so, so critical.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I was reading about this last week, and what was interesting and goes to Cate's point, Francis, was that when you look at Oregon, so the Northwest United States, Oregon, Washington, where, you know, even into BC and Canada, where there's been this liberalisation of drug laws, there were, unfortunately, we had a couple of things happen at the same time, and that was the COVID, so the massive economic downturn, increase in homelessness, which is already abysmal in the United States anyway, a fentanyl epidemic in the United States, just fentanyl washing through society and with catastrophic results. We don't have that in Australia at the moment. But all those two things occurred at the same time as, well, pretty much at the same time contemporaneously with cannabis legalisation. So it was easy for people out there to say, well, we legalise cannabis. And one of the arguments that they made in the United States for cannabis legalisation was put state taxes on it, and that money will be hypothecated to these services. That was the deal, you know. Legalise cannabis will put money into homelessness, mental health, addiction services, and all the rest. But they didn't bring in that social infrastructure to do it. And what I thought was really interesting was the experience in Oregon was that the police had been a really important interface with homelessness, with addiction, and they went. And so where normally someone would be, they would be involved with the police are taking them to a service. You know, not necessarily arresting them, they're saying, hey, you know, you've got to get off the street, or there's a service here, or they're taking them to, you know, they take them to the station and they get some advice about some services that are available. There's a shelter over here, you know, there's addiction services. The police were actually a really critical part of that process, and they just took them away. So they stopped policing it. And that meant that there was not the uptake, and, you know, some of the issues got worse. So it's critically important that when we're absolutely, that is the argument that is going to be used. I ran into the Treasurer the other day, and he said, I've just been reading about the experience in Oregon. And I went, right, if he's reading about that, then I need to be across that. That's something he's probably going to be saying in Cabinet. And it will be, and I think that the learnings for us is for us to say, look, if we go to a full legalisation model, we need to put in the social infrastructure to then deal with the new regime, to make sure that people who need help with addictive behaviours, abusing drugs, people homeless, all of those issues can get the services they need.
I think in New South Wales there is no way we're going to go legalisation before decriminalisation in terms of how conservative the government is. Like, I just can't see it. Decriminalisation for quite some time, I think, and then they'll have a look. But
Chris Minns did say in a budget estimates hearing, I said, you know, you said you were for prohibition once. He wrote an op-ed about that. What's happened? He said, well, we've got legalisation. We've got medical cannabis. That's legalisation. That was his attitude. And so it's legalisation if you can, you know, be bothered paying a doctor $100 and then paying, you know, $150 for 10 grams of skunk. But if you want to just grow some plants, but that's their attitude. And I think Kate's right. They are very timid, and I think they just see a lot of downsides at the moment. And one of the key things is, though, they're becoming more aware of who we are, the cannabis advocates, cannabis users, and they're realising, you know, that they're everywhere. So, yeah.
Any other questions?
Yep.
Has there been any trials or awareness around, like, decriminalisation or legalisation in areas that are affected by methamphetamine epidemics? Like, is there direct evidence of?
In Australia, I don't think so. So I don't think, because we haven't had a legalisation regime anywhere. I think they did in South Australia for a little while, but I think that predates meth, or, you know, like meth as we know it now. But the ACT will be interesting to see what happens there, because they've essentially got decrim in the ACT. They've got legalisation, essentially, for personal use. So it will be interesting to see, and those have only come in the last 6 months, 2 years. So it'll be interesting to see what happens over time. But I'm sure that there's a lot of studies in the United States on it, but I'm just, I'm not sure what they say.
So just to be clear, that's the Portugal model, like it's all drugs. So if anybody is caught, say, by the police with a personal quantity of ice on them, meth, anything, they go to what's called the Dissuasion Commission, which I had the privilege of visiting and met with the senior, from a professional perspective, met with the head of that. Then they interviewed by a social worker straight away. This is like the next day. And then they have a panel of 3 people that interview them who work out whether they're taking drugs recreationally, essentially, or whether they're addicted and need treatment. 10% of people will need to go to treatment. The other 90% won't need to. But if that person needs to go to treatment, they get into treatment within like 2 or 3 days in Portugal, because they transferred so much of the money that they were spending on policing to health and public health programs. So, and by the way, the treatment, people are there in terms of live-in for like 3 months or something until they, for as long as they need it. It's just absolutely incredible. And let's remember the ICE inquiry here in New South Wales recommended that. That was, the Commissioner did so many hearings, heard from people who had lost loved ones to ICE, the damage, the societal damage it's causing, and one of her key recommendations, Professor Dan Howard, key recommendations was decriminalising so that people can get the treatment when they need it. That's the issue, is that it's criminalised, and so if they're needing treatment, they won't get it. But the second one is if they pick up the phone and say, I want to get off this, they're told to come back in, they're told to call back in 4 or 5 months. Like as if in 4 or 5 months they're going to be in the same position. Like it's just, that's because we don't have the resources, because we're spending it all on, police and dogs and in the wrong places. So, you can look to I reckon, Portugal, huge success. Their addiction rates, their overdose rates just absolutely plummeted as soon as they did that. Plus they have a below the European average in terms of drug use anyway. And they kind of, by decriminalising it, they kind of this is not an actual word, but they de-sexified drug use. The same thing in Switzerland, where they've legalised prescription heroin. As soon as they did that, not as soon as, but a couple of years after, heroin use kind of just became this really daggy thing, because it was kind of legal for people who, were addicted. So that's interesting, depending on the legal framework. I think we're out. No? Any other questions? Can we see if there's any?
Or we can go and watch the Combi Convoy.
The convoy.
And the 420 Stoner Blaze.
Things to do outside. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
hanging out.
Thank you very much.